Okay, so there was an Angus Reid poll a couple of days ago. It was interesting, October 23rd, 2018, and it was measuring and evaluating Canadians' perceptions on the USMCA. So 50% of Canadians thought that the USMCA was a worse deal than NAFTA, and only 18% felt that it was better than NAFTA. The interesting part to me, though, was that 50% of respondents felt that Canadian negotiators were too soft or gave up too much for the USMCA negotiations. So the broader context of the argument here is whether or not these opinions are justified and whether that reflects reality. So in order to do that, you actually have to do some history, and this is part of the talk that will mirror a lot of what I said when I was here in April. You can't understand the current context of things unless you understand the broader evolving international trade regime of the last 70 years or so. And really it goes back to the immediate post-war period in the 1940s, where we get the post-war Bretton Woods Agreement, which sets up the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, but also this thing called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. So the GATT was supposed to deal with post-war liberalization, bringing down protectionist wartime economies, and it focused on tariffs. Tariffs were the main way that countries protected themselves. It was the most obvious thing to negotiate at the time. A tariff is simply a tax on a good when it comes to your border. Governments have used them for a very long time to raise money and protect industry, and that was what the agenda of the GATT was. And these are what are called first-generation trade agreements. They focus solely on tariffs. And there were 5 GATT rounds between 1947 and 1962, 60,000 tariff concessions, a lot of liberalization, and we saw the expansion of the GATT from 23 to 45 countries in this period, although primarily all Western developed capitalist countries at that time. So that's the reality of international trade up to the 1960s. In the 1960s, though, it's important because we begin to see a change take place, and we begin to see the introduction of what are called second-generation trade agreements. And it starts with the Kennedy round of the GATT in 1964. So on the table for the Kennedy round was the traditional first-generation stuff, tariffs, lots of tariff reductions. In Kennedy, roughly $40 billion in world trade was affected as a result of that round of negotiations. But why Kennedy is so important, and this has a lot to do with what's going to be talked about today, is that it's the first agreement internationally to deal with trade rules regarding trade, not just tariffs. And it was one narrow area of trade that was touched on in the Kennedy round. It was dumping. Dumping is a process where industry will dump a lot of product into a market at a very low price to try and drive out competition. So they'll flood a market with very cheap goods to drive out existing people in the market. The Americans argue we do that with softwood lumber, for example. So this was the first agreement to come up with an anti-dumping code, effectively rules to say that you shouldn't do these things. And this is the first example of what we call a second-generation trade agreement. Negotiations for that took 3 years. So when you start getting into rules, it takes a lot longer. And the fact that NAFTA didn't take a long period of time is right away a tip-off that there's something interesting here. Because whenever you're dealing with rules, it takes a very long time to negotiate new rules. We also see GATT membership rise to 48 states at that particular time as well. Tokyo round quickly follows, not quickly, it's in 73 to 79. Again, lots of tariff reductions in the Tokyo round of the GATT, but lots of new rules. And again, it takes 6 years to negotiate these new rules. Rules on subsidies, which is another trade practice, where you're subsidizing industry to protect industry. Rules on customs evaluations, trying to make customs harmonized from one border to the next so people know what procedures you're going to run into when you go to those borders. And for the first time, a dispute settlement mechanism. So countries could now, if you had a dispute with another country, you could now take it to the GATT and argue over those issues in these dispute settlements, which were brand new things in 1979. And we start to see the GATT expand to 102 states, now with a lot of developing states as well, not just developed states. So the big one here, and this is the one that followed Tokyo, is the Uruguay round. This took 7 years to negotiate. And it's profoundly important because of the nature of the rules that were touched on here. There are some tariffs dealt with in the Uruguay round, but this is a big rules-based agreement, and very complicated rules about very complicated trade practices. So services, trade and services, there's a whole section in the Uruguay round on services. It's called the General Agreement on Trade and Services. There's a whole section on procurement, the General Procurement Agreement. There's a whole section on intellectual property, a whole section on investment. This is the brave new world for rules-based trade here in terms of a multilateral setting on a large scale. Another important thing is the type of language that's used in these new agreements. So Uruguay represented a shift in the types of legal language that's used. Historically, trade agreements are what are called positive lists. They're very narrow. Countries are only committing to what they specifically say they're going to commit to, which again is a very narrow range of liberalization. What you see with the Uruguay round, though, is a shift to what are called negative lists. Negative lists are commitments where you say you're going to liberalize everything except for very specific exclusions. There's also hybrid lists in there. The GATS is primarily a hybrid list. It's positive and negative lists. So the nature of the language changing is also very important. It also created a brand new institution called the World Trade Organization, created a brand new dispute settlement mechanism with the WTO as well. And now we have the WTO consisting of 160 plus states, up from 123 in 1993. So this, if you want to know what significant change looks like, this is profoundly significant change when it comes to international trade. And we've now been in a next round of WTO negotiations called the Doha round. We are now in the 17th year of negotiations of the Doha round with no outcome yet. So again, trying to deal with advanced rules and changes to some very complicated things. So the fact that we got a new NAFTA in several months right away is a sign that probably not much really happened there, which we'll get into in a second. So what is the North American Free Trade Agreement? Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement is actually an extension and broadening of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The reason we got a Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was because Canada and the United States got frustrated with how long the Uruguay round was taking, the previous stuff that I just talked about, and they decided to pick what they wanted out of that and come up with a Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So a lot of what's in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was already negotiated and part of the Uruguay round negotiations. Now, what we also get with, the NAFTA is an extension of that with just more stuff in it. So very similar language. If you go through the WTO language, you go through the NAFTA language, a lot of it in the 90s there was very similar, and that's because they were simply borrowing stuff from both sets of negotiations. NAFTA also included tariff reductions, also included rules related to services, intellectual property, procurement, labor mobility. Again, a lot of that was very similar as to what was in the new WTO that happened at the same time. Rules of origin, though, on automobiles was something separate and distinct. In NAFTA, there is now rules that said that you would have 62.5% of all automobiles manufactured in North America would be from parts from North America. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement had similar language, but it was only 50% there. So that was something distinct and different than the WTO. The NAFTA also had some fairly controversial dispute panels as well. NAFTA included what was called a Chapter 11 dispute panel. Chapter 11 was for investment, and it was unique because it allowed companies to take governments to the NAFTA panel and complain of a loss of investment. If a government did something to some policy or procedure that limited their investment potential in a market, they could launch a Chapter 11 challenge, whether it be environmental standards, labor standards, those types of things. And Canada actually got dragged into a lot of these, and we lost several of them, and paid millions of dollars in damages to American companies because of those decisions. So that was in the original NAFTA. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And we also get two other sets of NAFTA panels as well, Chapter 18 and 19. Chapter 19 panels is where most of the softwood lumber stuff gets argued, so that was part of the original agreement as well. NAFTA is also significant because it also starts adopting more negative list language similar to what's in the WTO. So that's the background. Oh, sorry, there's one more slide. There's a lot of stuff that happened after NAFTA. Canada-Korea, these are just a small sampling of agreements. Canada-Korea agreement, the European agreement, CETA, the updated Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I knew I wasn't going to get that out. The CPTPP. So if you look at all of those agreements, though, there's similar trends. You have some tariff reductions. You have trade rules, but largely they're around already existing benchmark language and other agreements. And you got a lot of stuff that Canada likes to exclude. Alcohol, supply management, dairy, agriculture, those things. The two things I will say about CETA and CPTPP that are different. CETA had a lot of progressive language in it related to procurement. Opening markets, procurement is what governments buy primarily. Local governments, provincial governments, federal governments. CETA had some progressive language, liberalizing language in that was different. And there was some access to dairy, and this is what's important about understanding NAFTA. CETA opened up Canadian dairy markets by 3.25%. So European dairy producers now had access to 3.25% of our market in dairy. We also got access to the European market at the same amount. CPTPP was the same. We granted access to Asian markets into dairy, Canadian dairy, and we had access to their markets at the same level as CETA. I believe it was 3.25%. So we started to open dairy in previous agreements. I mean, there was small trends opening that up earlier than what happened with the new NAFTA. So again, the sum of all of this is, if you want to sum up the last 70 years in international trade in one sort of line, which I've done here, very incremental change. It's slow. It evolves very slowly. It takes time. It's asymmetrical in terms of liberalization. It doesn't happen. It's not like everything is liberalized all at the same time very quickly. Some things will run forward, like procurement and so CETA. Other things just stay the same and don't move much at all. And really, we're still stuck in this second generation of trade agreements. It's the same sort of thing. We're dealing with rules. That's what really all this is about, second generation. It's the old stuff, tariffs, and then it's rules. That's really what this is about, primarily. Okay, so let's talk about the new agreement. Dairies come under a lot of scrutiny. Dairies come under a lot of controversy. Dairy farmers will be quick to tell you that it's been a major threat to their livelihoods. So the first thing we need to understand is, what is supply management? Supply management is a combination of things. It's not one thing. You manage the supply of a particular product through tariffs, taxes on goods coming to borders, keeping stuff out. That's one way you can manage supply, or making it expensive to get into the market. Canada's supply management system in dairy certainly uses tariffs. It's also fixed prices. It's guaranteeing prices for producers, and that's something that we do in our dairy sector as well. And it's also quotas, limiting the amount of competition that can exist in a particular sector as well. So supply management is a combination of those things, and it's prevalent in the Canadian dairy sector and poultry as well. So, as I just suggested, CETA and CPTPP both opened access to dairy by 3.25%. It was reciprocal, so this is not a new trend, okay? The USMCA does the exact same thing to American markets, except it's slightly higher. We're granting access to 3.6% of our market, and we gain reciprocal access to their market of 3.6%. Although there are specific reductions that Canada has to reduce. So there's some things that we agreed to reduce our production in, and they're not insignificant, because I'm going to defend the dairy farmers here in a second a little bit. Skim milk powder, baby formula, and milk protein concentrates are things that we are cutting back our exports to the United States. And a lot of that has to do with industrial production of milk stuff, cheeses, and things that are done on a large scale, cheese production, which is kind of the way most things are these days. So that is not an insignificant thing here in terms of dairy. So what does this mean at the end of the day, actual cost? Supply management is still there. So nothing has happened to Canadian supply management. It still exists. We'll still be using those three things to affect supply of dairy into our market. And Ottawa has already come out and made it very clear that dairy producers will be compensated for any losses that are tied to this particular agreement. There is some validity, though, to the death by 1,000 cuts argument that the dairy farmers of Canada and others are making, because it is slowly opening the market little bit by little bit in every single agreement, and that will likely continue in the future as we move forward. And I don't want to suggest that the caps on the production that we've accepted here in those three areas are insignificant, because they are. Canadian dairy producers are going to have to reduce production in those areas. So there are some changes here. The last point I want to leave you with, though, is on dairy, though, is this is not going to solve the American problem either. U.S. farmers gain some access, but overall it's quite limited. There's more milk produced in the state of Wisconsin than Canada produces in its entirety, all on its own. So this is not going to suddenly open the doors for all those dairy farmers in the United States that are complaining about access to the Canadian market. There's still way more milk down there than they know what to do with, and that's not going to change. So, automobiles. Now it's 75% of North American auto content must come from the NAFTA region, up from 62.5%. 45%, and this is new, well, 75% is new, but so is this, 45% of that content must come from workers earning at least $16 an hour. And that's a direct attempt to try and address the wage gap issue with Mexico. Really doesn't have an impact on us. What does potentially have an impact on us is we now are subject to a quota system on automobiles to the U.S. market. So we're only allowed to ship so many automobiles to the U.S. market. But that quota as of right now is higher than what we currently produce and ship, so it's not going to impact us in the near term anyways. And perhaps most significantly, the USMCA avoided the U.S.-American threat of 25% on automobile tariffs. So by getting this agreement, it was a way to avoid, which would have been crippling. It would have seriously damaged our industry, but certainly would have damaged the American industry as well. Now, you haven't heard too many complaints from Canadian parts manufacturers, the automobile sector, regarding the USMCA, because it's really quite, I want to say it's neutral at best, neutral at worst, I would say, certainly positive at best. Canada is part of a deeply integrated regional market for automobiles. So I try and explain this to my class, that people have trouble conceptualizing this, but as a car is being put together in North America, that car will actually cross the border several times. It's cheaper because they're so regional and so specialized in specific things. The transmission will get put in Mexico, the engine will get put in not Mexico, in Michigan, the engine will get put in Windsor, Ontario, and it will move back and forth. That's what a supply chain is. The supply to that particular product comes from a bunch of different places. So deeply integrated, we're going to continue to benefit from the higher content levels, and I don't see anything negative there. Dispute settlement. The new agreement also has some issues related to dispute settlement. NAFTA Chapter 11 panels are eliminated for Canada and the United States. Those are the panels regarding investment that I talked to you about a few minutes ago. Those are not in the new agreement. They still are there for Mexico to a limited extent, and they are still there for that country, but not for Canada and the United States. Chapter 19 panels are still there as well, which were very important for Canada. This was one of the things that we said was a red line for Canada. We wouldn't sign an agreement if Chapter 19 was eliminated. And again, that's because a lot of our softwood lumber disputes end up in Chapter 19 panels. They're crucial for us dealing with the softwood lumber issue in this country. So some changes for dispute settlement, but as you'll see in one of the final slides, I'm suggesting there's not a lot that's negative there for Canada. Intellectual property. This is potentially controversial. Intellectual property is about patents, new inventions and things. So in pharmaceuticals, that's kind of where we're going to talk about here. Copyright is for published works, books, music, things like that. So that's what intellectual property in the USMCA is addressing. So what it did is lengthen patent protection on pharmaceuticals to 10 years. That was what the U.S. limit was all along. The U.S. always had patent protection on things for 10 years. Canada's was slightly shorter. I think it was 6 or 7 years. And what that allowed Canada to do was get products into the generic drug industry faster because the patent expired faster. So this is now going to extend that process and does have a potential impact on the Canadian generic drug industry and potentially higher costs for pharmaceutical users by extending that extra 3 years. So that is one potential thing that's associated with this. Copyrighted works, again, books, music, things like that. Under the USMCA, it will now become public domain 70 years after the author's death. And that was previously 50 years after the author's death in Canada. So again, we got things into the public domain faster than we did in the United States. The United States has the Canada 50-year mark is based on an 1886 convention that was quite standard in the international community. It's not just some random number we picked up. So that's why we had 50 years. The United States had 70 and Mexico had 100. So what this new agreement simply does is make it consistent for all 3 areas on copyright. It will be 70 years for everybody now. And for the record, that's exactly what we accepted in the CPTPP previously as well. So this is not a new thing. It's consistent with what we accepted in a previous agreement as well. Online shopping is also addressed in the USMCA. De minimis thresholds are amount consumers can buy without having to pay an export tax. So the USMCA deals with de minimis thresholds. So anybody who's bought anything on eBay will know what I'm talking about here. If you buy something from the United States on eBay or online, when you go to pick up your package, you will often have to pay Canadian tax on top of that, and then you'll have to pay some type of a Canadian border tax on top of that as well. So that's because in the previously, anything bought online above $20, which is really insignificant, was subject to both Canadian customs duties and sales tax. So if you bought anything online, eBay or whatever, you had to pay customs duties on that and sales tax on that above $20. So really, really low. What the USMCA does is raises that limit to $150 for customs duties. That's the duties part. Anything above $40, you're still going to have to pay Canadian sales tax on. So it raised those levels slightly. The United States limit prior to USMCA was $800. You could buy anything online and import it into the country with no tax or no duties for anything below $800. And that's what the U.S. wanted Canada to adopt, was the $800 limit. But we instead agreed to this 100, this 150 and 40 threshold. This benefits online U.S. retailers, obviously, eBay, et cetera. Potentially hurts Canadian local businesses who are going to have to still collect provincial sales tax and GST. But again, some new rules related to online shopping, but I would argue not necessarily significant. Okay, the last 2 sections here that I'm going to touch on are different and quite unique. So the first is Section 3210 of the USMCA, and this is the aspect of the agreement that says that signatories to the USMCA will not pursue agreements with other non-market countries. So anybody who's a signatory to the USMCA will not negotiate a trade agreement with a non-market country, whatever that means. And any attempt to do that, you must provide notice to other signatories and transparently share the results. Now, the controversial part about this, if the other members of the USMCA don't like what you're doing, they can withdraw from the USMCA. So the fear here is that if someone were to pursue a trade agreement with China, for example, the United States could then withdraw from the USMCA. Now, why is that in there? It's in there for a couple reasons, and I'll tell you why. One is, right now, there's some very valid reasons why it's in there. China has a very closed economy, even though it's a member of a number of international trade agreements. It has very discriminatory trade policies. It has numerous state-owned enterprises. There's not a lot of competition, and they have some questionable commitments to intellectual property. So defenders of this from the American side say that this is literally just giving the United States time and space to continue its ongoing battle with China over intellectual property and other investment issues. Other critics from the Canadian side say that that will limit our ability to negotiate new agreements. We'll have to see. Section 33 is also interesting because it's something no one expected, and it basically prohibits the 3 signatories from, and this is a quote from the agreement, manipulating the value of their currencies. And they have to transparently advise each other of interventions in currency markets. So if the United States is going to go into currency markets and try and manipulate the US dollars, it has to advise the other signatories. So this is kind of the surprise one, and this was a priority for the Americans, which was unexpected for Canada. And I'll come back to that in just a second here as I sum up. Because I would argue these last two things are what's really significant and transformational here in terms of the agreement. Other stuff in USMCA, 0 changes to procurement, WTO rules still apply, no changes to protections for Canada's cultural industries, lots of modernizing old language, the NAFTA language from the 1990s. There have been lots of subsequent agreements, so a lot of this negotiation was just going through the old language and updating it to new language, to other existing benchmarks in CETA and CPTPP. There is a sunset clause. We will revisit the NAFTA in 16 years, but that was beyond the 5-year limit that the United States had wanted, and we absolutely refused to go there for Canada. Canada, again, just wants the consistency and the stability for investment purposes. So what's different? Not much. Dairy, in my opinion, extends a comparable market access that we already granted in other previous agreements. Automobiles, status quo at worst, potentially much better. Dispute settlement, we're not going to miss Chapter 11. Chapter 19 is maintained, and that was the important one for us. Intellectual property and online shopping, once you get past the potential, this was really just about trying to standardize rules. That's all it was. Standardizing rules related to copyright patents and copyrights so that they're consistent in all 3 jurisdictions. And again, trying to make standardized rules so you don't have an $800 limit in one country and a $20 limit in another country in terms of online shopping. So I would argue not a lot. So I want to quickly say something about Canadian negotiators here, because a lot of the first slide suggested that most Canadians feel that Canadian negotiators didn't do a good job here. I would argue the exact opposite, actually. Because ultimately what happened here is we get an agreement, the USMCA, which is an ongoing representation of what Canada seeks in these agreements. Very incremental change, very small change whenever possible. If we're going to move forward on some things, it's usually one thing and one thing only, or a small number of things. And that's because Canadian negotiators, for the past 70 years, we have a profoundly respected reputation in the international community as being what some people have called chiselers. We are a pain in the ass to deal with in international trade agreements because we have these extraordinarily tough positions on issues and we don't budge. Some interesting strategies during the USMCA negotiations, they would present a negotiation session. The Americans would walk in, and the Canadians, this actually happened, the Canadians refused to negotiate. They instead had charts and graphs and sat there for an hour lecturing American trade negotiators on what they should and shouldn't be doing. And the Americans were there to do business and not get a lecture from the Canadians, but that's what happened. Canadians were very busy lobbying Congress. Canadians were very busy lobbying state governors. Canadians brought all sorts of issues on the table that they had no intention of ever negotiating and wanting in the USMCA. We dragged climate change onto the table, Indigenous rights, gender equality, U.S. anti-union right to work laws. Again, why did we do that? Because we were simply trying to do what we always do, be difficult to deal with and hold on really tight to the things that we really want to hold on to. And if you talk to American negotiation, they were absolutely exasperated. I don't know if you saw Leitzinger in his press conferences at the end. He was done. Like, he didn't want anything to do with us, especially our minister, who did a very good job dealing with the Americans. So what is this all about? Last slide here. What's the point then? What's the point of this thing? I argue that there's 4 points to this thing, and really not many at all to do with Canada. So the first is China. I think a lot of this has to do with China. In terms of 3210 and 33, I think for the Americans, it's a way of trying to present, it may not be a reality, but the perception of a very unified front, of a North American front, as it moves forward in its issues with China, whether it's trade and finance. I think that's trying to create that perception was very important for the Americans, and they certainly got that in this agreement. I absolutely think the USMCA is a branding exercise. Donald Trump could not keep the NAFTA agreement after he campaigned for president, disparaging the agreement. Every whistle stop, every speech, it was the worst agreement in human history. He couldn't let that thing stay. So we get a new agreement with a new name. It's now the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. They put us last because they don't like us anymore. And the acronym is also, if anybody knows it, most people might pick this up, it's also the acronym for the U.S. Marine Corps, right? I mean, this is very much a branding exercise, which leads to number 3, a political victory moving into midterm elections in November for Donald Trump and the Republicans. But the last one, I would argue, is also very significant. What Donald Trump and the Americans did very, very well in this negotiation was set the agenda. From the very beginning, they made it clear that there was going to be a very defensive negotiation here. Canada wasn't going to be a quid pro quo negotiation. It was simply going to be Canada having to defend its interest. We were always on our heels. They always had us on our heels, always throwing new stuff at us.